We'll call to order. Let that go. Call to order this meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission on October 14th, 2025, 11 a.m. Can you hear me through my microphone? It doesn't show the light, it's on. We'll take the roll.
Senator Rest.
Here.
Representative Anderson. Representative Anderson. Senator Barr.
Here.
Senator Dibble. Senator Dibble. Senator Drazkowski. Senator Drazkowski. Representative Greenman. Representative Greenman. Representative Hansen.
Here.
Representative Jacob.
Jacob here.
Senator Curran.
Here.
Representative Lee.
Present.
Representative Quam.
Present.
Senator Zhang. Senator Zhang. The roll has been completed.
Quorum has been established where our purpose today is to receive a presentation of the special review of the Department of Natural Resources timber harvest decisions in wildlife management areas. One of the longest titles I think we have seen, but very descriptive. Welcome to the committee. Auditor Randall, did you want to begin? And then we'll turn to Ms. Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor, and I want to thank you all for being here to meet and hear our special review regarding, and I'll say it one more time, this very long title, the Department of Natural Resources Timber Harvesting Decisions in Wildlife Management Areas. We'll call those WMAs going forward, so that might help shorten the title a little bit. As you likely know, WMAs are defined in statute as lands that have a high potential for wildlife protection. By law, DNR is required to manage these lands for certain purposes related to wildlife and wildlife habitat. Now, as you may recall, in August of 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service suspended a federal grant that had been awarded to DNR for years. In part, that federal grant funded timber harvesting in WMAs, along with other wildlife management activities. The federal government ultimately reinstated that grant in December of that year, in 23, but with numerous conditions placed on DNR related to timber harvesting on these special lands on the WMAs. At that time, OLA received a number of questions and concerns from legislators, from the public, regarding the federal grant suspension. So in response to those concerns and the federal grant suspension, we initiated this special review. However, when we started looking into the grant suspension, we identified several other concerns related to timber harvesting decisions in WMAs. For example, we identified that DNR had few formal plans or it had outdated plans identifying the wildlife habitat goals for the different WMAs. In other words, they had not established agreed upon wildlife purposes for which they were managing these special lands. As another issue, DNR had issued conflicting guidance, conflicting procedures, conflicting communication from leadership regarding timber harvesting in WMAs, especially regarding how decisions should be made to harvest timber in a WMA when forestry staff and wildlife management staff disagree on the benefits of such a harvest. And finally, we identified deep dissatisfaction among DNR staff regarding how the department has handled timber harvesting in WMAs. So what started as a relatively narrow special review for us looking at DNR's compliance with a federal grant ended up getting expanded to examining a number of different issues, all related to managing timber harvesting on WMAs and related to the unique purpose for which those WMAs are established in law. So it gets pretty complex pretty quickly. But to kind of walk us through our findings and recommendations, I would like to now turn to Ms. Tyson, who is our Deputy Legislative Auditor for OLA's Special Review Division. Thank you, Senator Rest, Madam Chair, and members.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tyson.
Madam Chair and members, for the record, my name is Catherine Tyson, and I'm OLA's Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Special Reviews Division. As Ms. Randall said, I'm here today to present our findings and recommendations from the Special Review DNR Timber Harvest Decisions in WMAs, shortening the title there. Before I get into our findings and recommendations, some background to give us some context. DNR manages about 5.6 million acres of land in Minnesota, and WMAs constitute a large portion of this land, about 1.3 million acres. By law, WMAs must be managed for the benefit of wildlife and related recreation. When we talk about habitat management, we're talking about processes that are used to create or restore or even maintain habitats to achieve certain goals. Habitats provide food, water, cover, and space to wildlife, and wildlife species need suitable habitats in order to maintain their populations or to increase their populations. Depending on DNR's goals for a given WMA, it could use different management techniques to affect the habitat, such as prescribed burns, brush mowing, forest regeneration, and in some cases, commercial timber harvesting. So just as a high-level example, let's say that DNR wanted to increase white-tailed deer population on a WMA. One possible management activity to achieve this goal is harvesting timber to create an opening in a dense forest. This allows the sunlight to hit the forest floor and creates more grass and foliage in early spring and late fall, thus providing additional food sources for the deer. For many years, DNR has included WMAs in its short and long-term planning for timber harvesting on WMAs, school trust lands, and state forests. In 2018, DNR set a strategic direction for the amount of timber to harvest over the next 10 years from these lands. These harvest amounts were informed by the Sustainable Timber Harvest Analysis, as well as other things. However, in the years that followed, various groups, including the federal government, groups of DNR employees, and wildlife advocacy groups raised concerns about the potential impact of DNR's timber harvest decisions in WMAs. And as Ms. Randall mentioned, in 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service temporarily suspended payments on a federal grant awarded to DNR due to its concerns about DNR's compliance with grant requirements. Based on this review, we concluded that the widespread uncertainty as to whether DNR has met statutory requirements has been due to a lack of plans, poor documentation, conflicting goals, and unclear guidance. Today, during my presentation, I'm going to be hitting on key findings and recommendations related to each of these 4 categories, starting with a lack of plans. I mentioned earlier, and I will mention several more times throughout this presentation, that state law requires DNR to manage WMAs for the benefit of wildlife and related recreation. This requirement in law is broad, so formal plans can help clarify what specifically DNR hopes to accomplish on a given WMA over a particular time period. Plans can also be an important tool for DNR when it's assessing its own performance, and it can also be a tool to hold DNR accountable by the legislature and the public. However, we found DNR has developed plans for a small number of the state's WMAs. Specifically, only 7 of Minnesota's over 1,500 WMAs currently have plans. And for the WMAs that have had plans, DNR did not update most plans for several decades. For example, DNR developed its first plan for the Red Lake WMA, the state's largest WMA, to cover the years 1980 to 1989. However, DNR did not update this plan until 2023, more than 30 years after the end of that initial planning horizon. Without plans that outline DNR's goals and objectives for each WMA, it's very challenging to assess whether DNR's timber harvesting decisions have been consistent with the statutory purpose of WMAs as well as DNR's wildlife goals for these lands. Additionally, it's also made it difficult for DNR staff to coordinate effectively when determining whether, where, and when to harvest timber in WMAs. As part of this special review, we conducted a survey of DNR field staff in the 3 divisions that are responsible for this decision-making process. In response to our survey, one respondent from DNR's forestry division said that if WMAs had plans, foresters and wildlife managers would have goals to work towards together. One Fish and Wildlife Division respondent wrote that each WMA needs a plan in order to develop habitat goals and to identify timber harvest opportunities that can benefit wildlife. So we recommend that DNR maintain current plans for those WMAs required by law to have plans, as well as complete plans for all other WMAs consistent with an agreement with the federal government. Speaking about legal requirements, we also found that federal and state laws have few requirements regarding WMA plans. For example, the state law requires a plan for WMAs with a, quote, resident manager, but the law does not define that term. Additionally, the law does not contain specific requirements for the contents of WMA plans, nor does it include a requirement for DNR to periodically update these plans. So we recommend to the legislature that the legislature specify which WMAs should have individual master plans based on defined criteria, indicate what DNR should include in the plans, and then require DNR to update master plans on a specified periodic basis. Related to the lack of plans, we also concluded that poor documentation has made it difficult to assess whether DNR's timber harvesting decisions have been consistent with the statutory purpose of WMAs as well as DNR's goals for WMAs. I mentioned earlier that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service suspended one of DNR's grants in 2023. Chapter 2 of the report outlines the events that led up to this grant suspension, as well as the 2 years that have followed the suspension. One of the issues the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service repeatedly raised to DNR in the years leading up to the suspension was that the department was not properly documenting the wildlife benefits of timber harvests in WMAs prior to initiating those harvests. So in our survey, we asked DNR field staff about DNR's practices for documenting the proposed timber harvests in WMAs. And many staff indicated that wildlife benefits of timber harvests had not been properly documented. Specifically, we asked, since January 2022, to what extent had DNR documented prior to approving timber harvests in WMAs that proposed harvest would result in wildlife habitat benefits? For the respondents in the Fish and Wildlife and Ecological and Water Resources Division, 70% of field staff responded sometimes or rarely or never. 22% of Forestry Division staff responded similarly. And I'll just remind you, without documentation, it's really challenging to be certain that timber harvests in WMAs have been consistent with the primary purpose for these lands. By law, as I've said before, DNR is authorized to harvest timber in WMAs only to protect, perpetuate, or reestablish wildlife habitat to produce wildlife, including for public hunting, fishing, trapping, and similar outdoor recreational uses. DNR's policies and procedures direct staff from multiple divisions to work together when making these decisions. Specifically, the policies and procedures direct staff from the Forestry and Fish and Wildlife divisions to share responsibility on the decision to harvest a given timber stand in a WMA. Further, the policies and procedures also require those divisions to consult with a third division, the Ecological and Water Resources Division, during this decision-making process. However, DNR's procedures and guidelines don't provide clear direction to staff on how to prioritize the statutory purpose of WMAs when making decisions about harvesting timber in WMAs. For example, there are 3 key policies and guidelines that prioritize the that are meant to guide staff's decisions in WMAs. However, none of those 3 documents clearly indicate that wildlife-related purposes must be the top priority or the deciding factor in DNR's consideration of any activity in a WMA, as state law requires. And again, many staff thought timber harvests and WMAs have not always been consistent with wildlife habitat goals. In our survey, we asked staff, to what extent have timber harvests since January 2022 been consistent with the goals of those WMAs for improving wildlife habitat? Only 14% of Fish and Wildlife and Ecological and Water Resources Division field staff responded always or almost always. Less than half of Forestry Division staff responded the same. As a reminder, DNR is authorized to harvest timber in WMAs only to protect, perpetuate, or reestablish wildlife habitat. Moving on to unclear guidance. I've mentioned now that DNR policies and procedures indicate that staff from multiple divisions with different expertise and different backgrounds to work together to make decisions to harvest timber in WMAs. However, the majority of DNR field staff we surveyed did not believe it was clear who had authority within DNR to make WMA timber harvest decisions. I'll direct you to page 42 of our report, Exhibit 4.2, and that shows that 3/4 of Fish and Wildlife and Ecological and Water Resources field staff, as well as the majority of forestry staff, indicated that clarity in this decision-making process was lacking. We also found that guidance from DNR leadership about roles and responsibilities regarding timber harvesting in WMAs has been unclear and insufficient. Again, page 47 of our report, Exhibit 4.3, shows that most field staff we surveyed indicated that division leaders had not provided them with sufficient training and guidance regarding timber harvests in WMAs. It was clear in the responses to our survey that the lack of WMA plans, poor documentation, conflicting goals, and unclear guidance has affected staff satisfaction. In our survey, we asked staff overall, how satisfied are you with DNR's habitat management in the WMAs in which you regularly work? 71% of Fish and Wildlife and Ecological Water Resources field staff who responded to our survey said that overall they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with DNR's forest habitat management in WMAs. Among forestry staff, those dissatisfied with WMA forest habitat management outnumbered those who were satisfied, about 40% to 27%. We have a number of recommendations for DNR. In summary, we recommend that DNR ensure that timber harvests in WMAs are identified for potential harvest, are subject to additional scrutiny to ensure wildlife considerations are prioritized over other competing interests. We also recommend that DNR amend its policies and procedures to emphasize the statutory purpose of WMAs. And we recommend that DNR ensure staff receive training and have access to WMA forest habitat management policies and procedures. With that, Madam Chair, I've concluded my presentation and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Tyson. Are there comments or questions from members? Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and want to thank the Audit Commission and the audit staff for doing this over the last several years. There's been a lot of inquiry about these practices and what's happening. And as former chair of Environment Committee, we supported this audit to provide the third-party objective evaluation of what is reality. And so I think, I guess, this is one piece of a kind of a larger piece that is been in place for probably a couple decades now, and that's that the public lands being used for private profit. And that the intent of viewing these things as a crop that are grown on public lands versus something needed for management. Obviously, the science shows that harvesting different management techniques can enhance management for wildlife. But the question is, what is the primary purpose? And it appears that that is in the eye of the beholder. So then what do we do as policymakers in looking at this data? We probably have to provide some clarity, legislatively, in terms of what is a public purpose and what are the consequences. A few years ago, well, probably more years ago than a few now, Madam Chair, with the Legacy Amendment, we established restoration evaluations to have third-party with the legacy dollars go out in the field and see if the restorations were real. Perhaps we need that restoration evaluations to see on the harvest if they're being replanted, if they're meeting those criteria, what happens. So this evaluation, I think, is really important. I have not read it all, but I look forward to reading it all, and also questions for the commissioner. But if there's not clarity, then we need to provide some. But I believe we need to provide some for the public purpose, not the private profit.
Thank you, Representative Hanson. Just to comment on your comment about clarity, what difference does it make if we provide clarity if the DNR doesn't follow the law? Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Rest. A couple quick questions. So the report seems to rely heavily on a survey. How many people filled out the survey? How broad of a spectrum are we looking at?
Ms. Tyson.
Madam Chair, Representative Jacob, we surveyed a total of 213 staff and we received responses from 181. Just for your reference, there's a footnote on page 38 of the report that provides some additional information, and we break down by division, which I could provide now if you'd like.
Oh, so 181 respondents.
Mhm.
One other question that you could answer for me.
Representative Jacobs, if you'd go through the chair, please.
Yes. Senator S, can I ask another question?
Well, you just have to address me first and then ask a question. That's fine. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Chair S. The second question then. For me to understand the federal funds that are brought into the timber harvest process, are the federal funds only for land in our state that is federally owned, or of this 5.6 million acres, much of that is just state owned, right? Some of it is federally owned. The state owned acres, are those receiving federal funds, or is this only on federal lands?
Ms. Tyson.
Madam Chair, Representative Jacob, the majority of WMAs in Minnesota are owned by the state of Minnesota. And the Department of Natural Resources uses state grant dollars, and many, I think most of the WMAs in Minnesota to pay for habitat management activities.
Madam
Representative
Chair.
Jacobs, do you have something further?
Madam Chair.
Auditor Randall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Jacob. I'd also just point you to page 9 of the report, where it lays out that nearly all WMAs in Minnesota are subject to the federal requirements. In addition to the grant award, there are requirements around how the state uses license revenue related to hunting and fishing licenses, and those are also subject to conditions from the federal government. So in effect, there's other reasons too that I could get into. For example, DNR does not have clear records on which WMA lands it purchased with federal funds versus state dollars. And so it assumes that all of the WMAs are subject to the federal requirements. So for many different reasons, including the actual use of the dollars and then some historic reasons, all of the WMA lands are subject to these federal conditions. And if I could just add one more point of clarification, Madam Chair. Representative Jacob, you're right, we did use the survey data for some of our work, but we also poured through innumerable emails and documentation from the federal government and grant conditions and policies and directives and procedures. So it was a pretty exhaustive look through DNR's documentation and historic policies and documentation as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jacobs,
Thank you.
anything further? Anyone else? Senator Coran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Thiessen, it sounded in our review previously, and it was difficult to measure almost every aspect of the work you were chartered to do. And so I believe there were 7 parcels out of 1,500 that actually had plans. And one of the conversations that we had it was very difficult to find the historical perspective of which lands fall into where and how, just from a history of how they were procured, how they landed under our jurisdiction. It sounds like historically it was that we don't have that information. Do we believe we have fixed that problem that we now, for every piece of land, we now have a detailed historical record that's accessible from this day forward? Do we think that has occurred, at least in your assessment in this review?
Ms. Tyson.
Senator Ress, Senator Cran, I think that'll be a great question to ask the department. That question is not answered in this review.
Excellent, thank you. I'm fine.
So Ms. Tyson, Senator Coran was referencing just how complicated this system is. That's why we have computers where you can put up a number of different but interrelated data sets. You can ask a question and it will tell you. It will tell you which 7, or it should tell you which 7 have plans from the briefing that you so graciously gave me yesterday afternoon. That accounts for about 40% of the WMAs and so forth. So why isn't that information not only accessible to staff at the DNR, which it looked like they have trouble finding it, it should also be accessible to the public with a simple question. Where is the plan? When was it adopted? What does it cover? And who do you have to interact with? And just because it's complicated is not an excuse for not having detailed information about these WMAs and the way in which they are assessed for legitimately giving contracts, I guess it's contracts or permissions, authority to cut down trees for the purpose of protecting wildlife and associated recreational activities, which is such a broad topic that it shouldn't be hard to come up with something that meets that requirement. It's not like saying it can't be more than this, or it has to have these kind of trees or these kind of trees or involve these kind of folks or so forth. It's a very broad directive. And it seems to me that not having the plans for the other 60% comes across not only in your description, but also in the department's response as a matter of colossal indifference. And we can do better than that, and the DNR can do better than that. And I'm glad to see that some of their responses in the commissioner's response that begins on page 65 has indicated that some of the findings and recommendations are partially resolved. I think was one, maybe there was more than one, but at least one that was completely resolved, and that, and then as you go further along, one after another, partially resolved or are unresolved. How confident are you, or Auditor Randall, are you that by the dates that are indicated in here, and for some of them that are partially resolved or unresolved, there's a date that is set that is after the sine die end of the biennial session, and who's going to know about those? Auditor Randall?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to try and address as much as I can of what you said. In terms of how confident am I? I mean, certainly the commissioner is here, and she and her team can speak to their commitment to doing what they said in the letter. I do know that our report is, much of our report was not new information to them. And so I think that they have an interest between this report and the conditions from the federal government to put a lot of this in action. So for example, the recommendation to develop plans for the remaining WMAs, which, as you correctly said, represent 60% of the land in WMAs. That is part of their commitment to the federal government as well, and tied to those grant funds to come up with those plans. Now, some of those WMAs are very small acreage. And so it doesn't mean that there will be a unique plan for each of the 1,500 WMAs across the state, but it might mean that there is a plan for a group of WMAs in a region of the state. This is why what we're hoping to manage these lands for. We want to develop wildlife habitat, this type of habitat, which will help foster these types of species, right? So it's going to be a whole an array of species, an array of habitat. So again, their commitment to the federal government was that they would develop these at least regional-based plans. So I do believe that there is sincere motivation there. There are dollars tied to that. That is often a good motivation. I would also note that, whether or not the legislature is in session, this report will exist, and anybody who is in office at any time can pick it up and ask the DNR, in a hearing or separately, how are things going, right? I mean, this is information for all of you and your colleagues to continue to follow up with the Department of Natural Resources. So I would expect that this is an ongoing conversation with them. Some of these recommendations are going to take quite a bit of work. It's not something that can happen overnight. And so I think ongoing communication with them will certainly help to demonstrate your interest in this getting accomplished, and then also help to ensure that they keep moving forward.
Thank you, Auditor Randall. On some of them, that the last time they looked like they thought about it was in 1989, that might be a reason, since they haven't been kept up to date, why now it seems to be a daunting task. I also would like to know in the survey of staff, let me see where that was. What page is that on? Sorry. Or maybe it's in the. It's on page 9 in the overall thing. Following taking this survey, and I think, was it you, excuse me, Representative Jacobs had asked how many employees they had actually surveyed? And what was that number again, Auditor Randall?
Madam Chair, it's on page 38 of the report in footnote 14. And I believe it was 181 of the 213 staff we surveyed responded. So 85% of those who received the survey responded, for a total of 181 staff.
So did you have, Auditor Randall, did you, or Ms. Tyson and your staff, did you have conversations about these survey questions with the staff? And it's, you know, when I look at the one that says staff dissatisfaction, for the fish and wildlife and ecological and water resources respondents, I see there were 72. There was no one who said they were very satisfied. That I find that distressing, just as an observation. And did a little bit better with the forestry respondents. Did they offer any, when you had your exit interview or discussions with the leaders at DNR, did they offer any explanation of their own understanding of why the survey with regard to staff dissatisfaction was so much on the negative side? I mean, it's a great occupation. What they do is the heart of Minnesota. Why aren't they satisfied with the WMA program of cutting down trees for the white-tailed deer? I mean, what did they say?
Madam Chair, in our survey.
Ms. Tyson?
Thank you. In our survey responses, as well as our individual interviews or conversations with staff, I mean, it really came out to be dissatisfaction was based on the lack of plans, the lack of clear guidance, conflicting goals. And I think throughout chapter 4, we do provide a number of quotes that kind of illustrate those issues. And I think that through the department's ongoing continuous improvement process, which the commissioner wrote about in the response, DNR has identified some of these exact same issues through that analysis. And I think that would be an excellent question to hear from them exactly where that's going.
Any other question yes, I see there are. For Ms. Tyson or Auditor Randall, we'll start with Representative Jacobs. Representative Jacobs.
Chair S. So my question is, how many total DNR employees are there? And how were these 100 or 213 selected out of the total number of employees?
Ms. Tyson.
Senator Rest and Representative Jacob, we focused our survey on field staff in the 3 divisions that are responsible for making decisions about timber harvesting in DNR. To some extent, we relied on leaders in each of the divisions to identify who was responsible for these types of decisions. I'll say there wasn't kind of an easy listserv, for example, to just send this to. So we had to rely on leadership to identify these individuals. As to the total number of DNR staff, I don't have an answer today for that.
Representative Jacobs,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask them to provide that number to us. You can just send it in an email to the members of the commission if you would.
Yes,
Okay.
Chair S.
Go ahead.
So that would just leave me with a concern of, my sense is that there are many thousands of DNR employees that you could get a certain result by picking so very few people to send the survey to. Yeah, I'm concerned about the answers to the survey just due to the,
So Representative Jacobs, I thought that these were the people who actually worked in the WMA program, so that it was a select group. Did I
Yes.
misunderstand that?
yeah. Chair, that's the reason that I asked how many DNR employees there are. I would say that my sense is that 213 is just a fraction of the amount of people that would be in the field. So my concern
I
is,
see.
that you ask certain people who you want a certain outcome, you're going to get the outcome you want.
I see. Well, I, um, I take a little bit of offense at that because that, the legislative auditor does not begin a survey with a preconceived, results. And, maybe even if there were only 50 people, if they were randomly chosen to respond or responded only because they had direct access and worked in those programs, asking the whole of the DNR staff would not be very enlightening because they wouldn't have anything to do with these particular programs. Auditor Randall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and you took many of my words right out of my mouth. So I want to make it clear that we do not have an agenda when we conduct our work, right? We are simply looking for facts and information. We are not looking for a specific outcome that is kind of anathema to the work the Office of the Legislative Auditor does. What we did in this case is we wanted to identify the DNR staff who had experience working in WMAs where timber harvesting often occurred. So if you think about the expanse of DNR's responsibilities, which are vast, right? State forest land, different set of issues there. Lakes and, surface water, different set of issues, right? So we were looking for looking to identify all of the field staff. So not a sample, but the whole universe, which is really the gold standard if you're going to be doing survey work, of everybody who works in WMAs and then also who has timber harvest experience in WMAs. So Madam Chair, if you would indulge me for just a moment, I'd like Deputy Legislative Auditor Tyson just to read parts of footnote 14 on page 38, because it really gets into how we identified who we surveyed and how we really tried to be as expansive as possible with people who would have something knowledgeable to say, right? It wouldn't make sense to survey people who've never stepped foot in a WMA or who have never been involved in timber harvest. That would not be a good survey methodology. So if you would indulge me and let Ms. Tyson do that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Senator Ress and Representative Jacob, starting alphabetically for the Ecological and Water Resources Division, we asked the division director to identify the staff who work on this exact issue from that division. The division director identified 14 total staff, and 11 of those 14, or 79%, responded to the survey. For the Fish and Wildlife Division, again, we worked with DNR leadership to develop that list, focused to the folks who, as Ms. Randall said, work on WMAs and WMAs that have had timber harvests. We surveyed 67 staff from the Fish and Wildlife Division, and 61 responded for a response rate of 91%. For the Forestry Division, we ended up serving the entire group of staff of foresters that work on WMAs. That was 132. But the division director had recommended that we limit the survey to field staff who at least 26% of their geographic work was on a WMA, to make sure that we're focusing again on the staff who are commonly consulting on these issues. That ended up being a total of 44 staff, 37 of which responded for a response rate of 84%.
Thank you very much. I hope others will read that description from page 38. Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things that came to mind when you're early on in your discussion, the forest management evolved somewhat because looking past decades and across, there were periods of greater wildfire and forest fires. And so outside looking in, my thought is some of their management scheduling and practices may be changed over the period of time. And I believe we actually have had less recent forest fires in Minnesota, or they've been smaller. So did you look at the general forest management practice when it came to that with harvesting? Because, you know, we got WMAs, we got parks, state land. There's a lot of forests up north, so that if they're going to do a logical process, they're going to do an area with a periodicity, and you're probably going to have some WMAs included with others because you want to do that preventative. So did any discussions or information relative to that happen?
Ms. Tyson?
Senator Rest and Representative Quam, one of the things that we discuss in chapter 1, and then I think again in chapter 4 of the report, is DNR's kind of like large scale planning process for selecting timber harvests in WMAs and state forests and in school trust lands. And to some extent, that model takes into account those kind of differences in terms of trying to get the right age and the right species and things grouped together and things like that. But really the focus of this review, we were looking at basically compliance with the state law that requires that these habitat management activities be to protect, perpetuate, and reestablish wildlife habitat.
Madam Chair,
Representative Quam.
what comes to mind to me is that we've seen multiple occasions of where a fire starts somewhere and then spreads. So when you do your management, it's more of a global approach. And frankly, I think that when you have a forest fire, you sort of lose your wildlife habitat dramatically. That's why when there was a lack of adding the caveat of the forest management to prevent such occurrences, hopefully our next testifiers will have, some clarity there. The other thing I was curious about is what accounts and proportional percentage that when you're harvesting timber, there's a fair amount of revenue. In fact, I think the DNR gets 30–40% of their total budget is not from out of our budget, but from forest management fees and other things that come into them. So was there any look at where this money was going to? What different accounts, sort of a breakdown, because that would help us understand maybe the other influences to pushing for forest management. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Tyson?
Senator Rest and Representative Quam, we don't provide such a breakdown in this report, so I'd have to follow up with you to provide that information at a later date.
And from my notes, from the cut timber, then the federal grants, that amounts to 20 to 25 million per biennium. That correct?
Senator Rest, yes, on page 9 of the report, there's a little table that shows the the grant awards that DNR had received dating back to fiscal years 2016 to 2017. The most recent biennium DNR's award was $36.6 million.
So in that biennium or in this biennium, or those, that time period, 24, 25, there was a almost 1/3 jump in the revenues there. Representative Hanson?
Thank you. Senator Dibble is having technical difficulties.
Oh,
So he wants me to ask a question, and it's on this. He and Representative Quam are on the same wavelength.
did he sent you a question
sent
to
me a
ask of
question,
us?
so
Okay,
if I
or to
can-
ask of them? Okay, fine, go ahead.
So we just talked about the money received through grants. The question Senator Dibble had is how much revenue comes in from the sale of the timber on public lands over time,
Which is different from
the grant revenue.
the grant money. Ms. Tyson?
Senator S., Representative Hanson, and Senator Dibble. Yes, we were just talking about the revenues from the grant. I'll have to follow up after the fact for revenues from timber sales.
Okay, Representative Hanson?
You were close there, Senator.
Hmm?
You were close there, but
Yep.
Senator Rest and members. So I've noticed over recent audits, and then probably will be audits in the future, where we tend to question the auditor on their methodology, on their procedures, on their practices, but we don't get into the actual outcome. We had the federal government withheld money in grants here. So it wasn't the auditor that withheld money, wasn't the legislature, it was the federal government withheld money. We have seen over the last several years, the federal government taking action in the Pollution Control Agency with inspections, et cetera, when the state government may not have. The federal government is in a different place right now. And if, to your question, Senator Rest, if the state doesn't act, is there a judicial review process where the people of Minnesota can compel the agency to act? And by acting, I think the question for the people is not on the plan. I'm not that excited about funding plan writing. I'm more interested in the outcome to get what a plan should do. That, are we restoring the forest? Are we doing it for management? Is the decision there? Is there another venue through the judicial branch if the public sees that something isn't being done? If the federal government, the tool of withholding federal money is no longer used, or federal inspections aren't used, and if the state government doesn't have the funds or the inability to use those funds, what is the role of the public to provide for accountability?
Auditor Randall or Ms. Tyson?
Uh,
You want to hand it off to her? It's
Yeah.
fine.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Hanson. Well, I think the public always has a number of different tools to pressure for outcomes or to demand accountability, right? One is through elections. One is through reaching out to all of you to say what their concerns are and to hope that you represent them here. If they believe that a state agency is not complying with the law, they can certainly take private legal action. It's a heavy cross to bear, but I think they could try. The public puts pressure on us to conduct special reviews, and they give us allegations. And so that's another form of accountability and oversight. Now, we can only do so many, but this report is one of those tools, right? It gives you additional information. But at the end of the day, I really think it's the legislature that has the responsibility of the oversight and holding the executive branch accountable. I mean, you have established these laws. You have appropriated money to agencies for these purposes. And it's through your questioning and holding those agencies accountable that you can ensure you're getting the outcomes you expect.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? If not, we invite the commissioner to come forward with her assistant commissioner and the National Resources Director to respond to the report. Welcome to the Legislative Audit Commission. If you would identify yourself, please, for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're right on the cusp between morning and afternoon, so thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Sarah Stroman. I have the pleasure of serving as the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. With me here to my right is Fish and Wildlife Division Director Kelly Straka, and Assistant Commissioner Bob Meyer is also here with us today. First, I want to thank Auditor Randall and Deputy Auditor Tyson for their and their team's work on the special review on timber harvest decisions in wildlife management areas. As you just heard, they did a real thorough look at our program, and we appreciate their work. We're also pleased that this is the second recent independent audit with no findings related to statutory or grant compliance issues. We sincerely value the OLA's recommendations in this report. We are committed to accountability and transparency, including third-party review of our work. And we are pleased that the recommendations contained in this report generally align with areas of improvement that we previously identified and are actively working to address. Some of the recommended actions have already been completed and others are in progress. I'll briefly cover the DNR's response to those recommendations, and you also have our complete response letter contained in the report. To the recommendation pertaining to federal grants, we agree with the recommendation and believe the matter to be resolved. In March of 2024, a letter from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Martha Williams stated, "We now have a mutual understanding and agreement about DNR's procedures and our agency's grant process. Considering the current statewide wildlife habitat management grant in place, I am confident we are on a path forward that works toward our shared missions of conserving fish, wildlife, and their habitat for future generations." A July 2025 Office of Inspector General audit stated, "We found the department ensured that grant funds and license revenue were used for allowable activities and complied with applicable laws and regulations, Fish and Wildlife Service guidelines, and grant agreements." To the recommendation pertaining to WMA planning, we agree with the recommendation and are actively working to complete those plans. To the discussion that the commission was just having, we need to have plans for those wildlife management areas. These are public lands. The public should have an opportunity to participate in the development of those plans, and they should have access to viewing those plans for accountability and transparency. In May 2022, I directed the DNR's Fish and Wildlife Division to complete the major unit plans according to a schedule, with the final plan to be completed by June 30th, 2025. Major unit plans are now complete, and that includes plans for all WMAs with resident managers. That is in accordance with state statute, as well as our commitment to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. At the same time, I also directed the Fish and Wildlife Division to initiate a system-wide planning effort to cover the remaining wildlife management areas and aquatic management areas. Public engagement on that planning effort is set to begin yet this calendar year, and this planning project is scheduled for completion by December 31st, 2027. To the recommendations pertaining to leadership and decision-making, we agree with the three recommendations and are actively working to resolve them. In 2023, after meeting with staff from each of the 3 divisions engaged in forest management work, it became clear that there were significant differences between DNR leaders' intent for forest management coordination and our staff's experience with implementation. You see this reflected in the survey that the auditors did as well. After those meetings and after hearing what we heard from our staff, I directed the 3 division directors, the Ecological and Water Resources, Forestry, and Fish and Wildlife, to initiate a continuous improvement action plan. Work remaining as part of that plan includes revising guidance documents, developing and implementing training around forest management policy and procedures, and continuing our commitment to clear and consistent communications to all staff involved in forest coordination. Specifically, the Fish and Wildlife Division will update its 2009 directive regarding forest management on WMAs and AMAs, and the 3 divisions will also issue a common directive to ensure staff engaged in forest management have the same baseline understanding of how the DNR approaches forest management, including the special considerations related to WMAs and AMAs and the purposes of and restrictions on those areas. Those directives will be complete and issued by November 21st, 2025. The 3 divisions will update the procedure for forest habitat management on lands administered by the Fish and Wildlife Division. That update will include an outline of the process, roles, and responsibilities of staff involved in forest coordination, and include guidance for the use of a new habitat value form to document the fish and wildlife objectives met by proposed timber harvest on WMAs and AMAs. That update will be complete by January 31st, 2026. And third, the 3 divisions will provide comprehensive training to staff responsible for forest management. That initial training will roll out by March 31st, 2026, with ongoing training thereafter. And I'll just note that while our continuous improvement commitment is ongoing, we do intend to close out this specific project and these tasks by the spring of 2026, as I've just noted. In closing, DNR has taken an integrated and interdisciplinary approach to forest management for more than 3 decades. This involves coordinating across divisions, disciplines, and administrative land types. It also involves planning and managing at different scales, including spatial scales from the site level to the landscape level to statewide, and temporal scales from the current year to 50 to 100 years into the future. Taking this interdisciplinary approach across multiple scales represents both best ecological practice and the most efficient and effective use of public resources. It does not negate our ability and responsibility to manage according to different statutory purposes. And we do believe we do both these can do both these at the same time. We also acknowledge that forest management at DNR is tremendously complex, something that Auditor Randall just noted, and it's something that our 2 independent third-party forest certification auditors remark on during virtually every visit they make on an annual basis. There is a body of written documentation, including policies, directives, and plans, as well as practice that has evolved over time. And as I said, that is more than 3 decades of time we've taken this approach. We know that Minnesotans, including DNR staff, care deeply about how the state's forest resources are managed, and that is true of the forest resources on WMAs. With the steps outlined, we are committed to improving clarity and understanding around our forest management planning system, both internally and externally. Again, want to thank the Office of the Legislative Auditor for its independent review and recommendations. While much of this work was underway, I think this audit has helped us crispen our timelines around completing that work. And thank you to the Commission for the opportunity to be here today. We are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Ms. Straka, did you want to comment?
Madam Chair, members, Kelly Straka, Fish and Wildlife Division Director. I don't have any comment at this time, but certainly I'm happy to talk specifically about implementation of some of the things that we've had underway if there are questions.
Are there questions?
Dwayne.
Oh, I looked to my right first, so I saw Hanson, and then I'll come back to Representative Quam.
Thank you, Madam.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So almost 10 years ago now was the million cord goal from Governor Dayton. And we had X number of mills, whether they're paper, pulp, lumber at the time, that were looking for that source. Almost 10 years later, and I mean, you can get the exact number, but just what's the percentage of those mills that are still here?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner?
Representative Hansen, I do not have the answer to that question here today. I'm just going to see Assistant Commissioner Meyer does not either. We can get that information and provide it to the commission.
Representative Hanson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And continuing on this line.
Of course.
So then we went from 1 million down to 800 and some as a goal. And that's still 7, 8 years ago. But the world has changed, you know, instead of paper, where people are communicating electronically. You know, when we set the goal to have the harvest, then you have the harvest rather than the management potentially. And so do we really need to look at a realistic goal with a purpose and not picking a number, but picking the need for the future? Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner?
Representative Hansen, so I just want to back up a minute because I think there were two parts to the question Governor Dayton asked and then sort of how we use that going forward. So you are correct. Governor Dayton asked DNR to look at this question of, is it possible to sustainably harvest 1 million cords off state lands? And if not, what is the number we can sustainably harvest off state lands? That was a point in time analysis that we completed, the DNR completed in 2018, that answered that question. The answer to the first question was no, we cannot sustainably harvest 1 million cords off state lands. The second part to the question was that number then, and it was 870,000 cords. So that was the point in time analysis and the answer to Governor Dayton's question. In the process of developing that analysis, the contractor that we used to help us complete that analysis had developed a model. And what we decided to do was use that model going forward. And in that model, we then were able to essentially add a step to this 3-decade history of interdisciplinary forest management that allowed us to look at a statewide scale and look 10 years out. So we added that 10-year stand exam list and a statewide scale. And essentially what that model does is help us understand the level of disturbance that we want across at a statewide level to meet multiple forest objectives, not just timber, but clean water, habitat, recreation, all of those things. The model helps us balance it out. And so it is, the goal is around that level of disturbance that at a statewide scale, we would want to see to balance all of those things. So then out of that 10-year stand exam list, we have an annual stand exam list. Clearly, some of those stands are on wildlife management areas. Those lands, we're not balancing all of those values, right? As the auditor just pointed out, those lands are to be managed for wildlife purposes. So then there is a site level process that comes into play to basically determine the management regime at the site level. So long answer to your question, in some ways, Governor Dayton's question is not really the question we are using to guide our forest management. It is that level of management. And then in many cases, we use commercial timber harvest to get that management or that disturbance done on the landscape because it is the most cost-effective way to do so, and it provides a usable product to those mills. There are other ways, particularly on WMAs, and Director Straka could describe those, that we get that management work or that disturbance done through with other dollars, whether that be prescribed burns or some kind of woody mass removal. So I think that answered your question.
Finally, Madam Chair.
Representative Hanson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we pick a number of what we could do, that may be different than what we should do. The question I have is, if a regional manager determines that the plan, things have changed, weather, climate, growth, wildlife, et cetera, does the regional manager have the discretion to say no to the harvest? Because they determine through their scientific background, through the plan, through their best expertise that it should not be done. Do they have the discretion to say no? And then if they do, then does industry have the ability to appeal that or go and reverse that decision?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner?
Thank you. Representative Hanson, the answer to that is yes. So the number is a metric we use basically to over time. And we did a midpoint review to that 10-year period not long ago and say, are we creating that level of disturbance, that level of management that we intended to create? The answer may be yes, the answer may be no, because at the individual site level, again, people are our staff on the ground, whether it be the area supervisor or at the region, are looking at those sites and saying, does a particular management regime make sense here? Should there be a timber harvest to achieve on WMAs a wildlife objective? On state forests, similar process. Should a timber harvest achieve the objectives of that particular site? And if so, what does that prescription look like? So yes, there is flexibility for those site level decisions built into that. And to be very clear, that number is a metric, not a quota.
Representative Quam?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Where do the revenues from the timber harvest go?
Commissioner?
Madam Chair, Representative Quam. So it depends on the underlying designation of the land. So if it is a state forest, those lands go into the forest management account. If it is school trust land, right, there's a process there. They go into the forest management account. Costs are certified. The proceeds go to the trust. On WMAs, those timber revenues must basically be reinvested in wildlife management.
Representative Quam?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the answer. That I just wanted people to understand that for the WMAs, anything, it's not going off to somebody's little stash. It's being kept and separated for that. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner?
Just one thing too, that is a point that the federal audits, the routine Office of Inspector General audits of our federal funding and those grants look at basically, did we conduct allowable activities? Are we using those funds appropriately? And for any revenues generated, are we depositing those correctly? So the answer in this most recent audit was yes.
Senator Coran?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, I think this report highlighted, even though it was focused on WMAs, we've kind of discussed our forestry management overall. You arrived in 2019, and so the current action, which is likely, it appears to be driven by the loss of a grant, did your current planning or the outcome of where we're at today, was the impetus the loss of those funds? Is that when you initially started, or was it as a result of this report, or when this evaluation started?
Commissioner?
Madam Chair, Senator Cran, we had begun these continuous improvement actions and the plans prior to this audit. I think this audit still provides great value because the questions from the public and our staff were ongoing. And I think, as I said, and as Auditor Randall said, our conclusions have largely merged. And I think that's a good thing to have that independent look to tell us, we are on the right track with those things. Some of these actions began before we mutually agreed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to suspend that grant. There were ongoing conversations about the grant conditions and our compliance with the documentation. And I want to be clear, the letters we have from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service were very specific to the grant documentation. And I'll just add that was due to some new terms that were placed in that 2021 to 2023 grant that frankly had some confusing language about what was required prior to activity and what was required post as a post activity performance report. We should have cleared up our misunderstanding over that. We did not. And as staff were trying to work that out, the regional leadership at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and I decided the best thing would be to pause the grant, to get that work done, and then once it was done, to restart the grant so that the state was not incurring additional work as we were trying to figure out a solution to this. But the work with our staff was already underway at that point.
Madam Chair.
Senator Correa.
Thank you, Commissioner. And you can understand where we are when we hear these reports. So we're looking at, they're trying to find something measurable. It's the only eyes and ears that we as the legislature have, and certainly the citizens have, to measure what the legislature has given as instructions under statute. So in the WMAs, we've been a little bit, we've been more specific and less specific all at the same time relative to our overall forest management. But at the end of the day, you just described, as it relates to Representative Hansen's questions about your plans and overall forest management, the harvest, and you described a plan. But what we don't see is the description of a plan that's measurable clearly out of the result of this review. And so I have to look at it and say, well, how do we know we're managing the forest based on what needs, how, what, right? Representative Hansen brought the possible conflict. Are we letting industry drive these things, or do we have a forest management plan that's holistic in nature relative to storm, blowdown, right? Do we clean up the lands? How much harvest do we need to have a healthy forest, right? I don't want to put motives in there about what it is, but in addition to, I think I mentioned on the way in, do we have the market will we be able to maintain the market? And there's a balance that we're going to need, or we'll be in a position where we want to harvest and we can't, or the costs are going to be exponential and the revenue, all those things will be outside of the borders of this state. And so we worry, you've only been here since 2019, but we're talking about decades of lack of clarity when we hear that, well, we can't even trace back a simple real estate transaction to understand how we acquired land. It's probably one of the most well-documented things that we do in this state. Go to every transaction is recorded at a county level. If we failed to track those things when the agencies had that sole responsibility, in fact, it's the only reason the agencies exist, you can understand where we have great concerns. And I think it's followed up with, yeah, we've got a plan, but we always seem to be, well, we got a plan now, or we've resolved some of the issues now, when it's been the sole responsibility of the agencies for decades. Doesn't matter what agency. And that's what we have concerns with. I didn't hear anybody say, well, we have a plan for legislative clarity so we can showcase what the heck we're doing. And so it can be measured by the independent review, and that we as legislators can feel good. We actually accomplished whatever the heck we were trying to do. And I think it's overall reflective in this survey, which I do appreciate. It was very targeted. these are the people doing the job. They're the experts on the front line. That's how I see them. And they're completely detached from what decisions you're making and the leadership is making. That's in my mind what it reflects. And everybody's heard my rants forever. When are you going to change, and when are you going to start to have a full life cycle of training in every state agency we have that focuses on the value and the reason for every position existing? And that means the frontline people have to be supported, or they have to feel like they're the ones leading. They are the experts, but clearly they're not. You described, yeah, we're great. We as management, we got some new plans together. Without them being the primary driver for it, it will never be successful. We're gonna be here 10 years from now. Maybe some of us won't be here. Somebody's gonna be sitting in these seats, and we're gonna be having the conversation with another commissioner. And so we're gonna want to see you have some legislative guidance that we can debate and articulate to get to something that we all agree that we have a holistic management outside of WMAs. Clearly, we need focus on WMAs. But what are we going to have as a legislature to understand that, one, you have the plan, and two, that it is executed, and then three, that we can earn trust so we can fund agencies and do business as our citizens expect. So there's I know I don't have any question. I think your statement is clear. This brings a lot of it together, or just highlights where we're missing those pieces. And you've been here since 2019. And so we'll look for that guidance and expertise on what an outline would look like as you guys being the experts in that forestry management, not just in WMAs, but in, overall forestry that we, the legislature, can buy into. So I appreciate it, and I appreciate the legislative audit work. These things highlight many of our weaknesses or just our failures to provide focus. And at the end of the day, we need something that's truly measurable, and you got to help us get there. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Coran. I don't know anybody who is present today sitting here could have expressed it better, and about our concerns and our interests. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other final comments for the commissioner or Ms. Straka? Other than that, Commissioner, do you have a final comment that you'd like to make?
Madam Chair, I do not. Just to say thank you again to Auditor Randall and Deputy Auditor Heisen and their team, and to this commission.
Thank you very much for your presence here today, for speaking with us, for your cooperation with the legislative auditor and the deputy legislative auditor for special reviews. It's very much appreciated, and the positive way in which we can receive your comments and have them ready for the public. There being no further business before the commission, we're adjourned. Oh, if you have your thing, yeah.